No matter where you are in the world, get ready to be hooked. I haven't touched a man under 15 years. The pregnant male order bride said, then married him. A story so powerful, it will leave you speechless. What happens next isn't just surprising, it's unforgettable. So hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share this with someone who loves a good story. From the US to the UK, from Asia to Africa, this one's for Wow You. Let's dive in. Sarah tightened her grip on the handle of her worn leather suitcase as the train slowed to a screeching halt, steam hissing in clouds along the length of the platform. Cedar Falls, Montana, stretched out before her in quiet stillness, the kind of town where time seemed to linger in the spaces between mountains and sky. At 35 years old, Sarah had never once imagined that she would be stepping off a train as a mail order bride, her heart pounding with both dread and fragile hope. What weighed heaviest of all, however, was the unmistakable swell beneath her dress. 6 months along now, she could not disguise the truth of her condition. The sharp mountain air rushed against her cheeks as she descended the steps, her boots clunking softly against the wooden platform. People moved about with hurried purpose, families greeting loved ones, men hoisting crates of supplies, children darting about with shrill laughter. But Sarah felt as if every eye might turn toward her secret, though most were far too busy to notice. She adjusted her shawl over her belly, clutching the suitcase tighter as though it might anchor her trembling spirit. Somewhere among these strangers stood the man who had answered her desperate letter. She had written words of honesty, though not the full truth. How could she? To reveal everything from the start would have meant no reply at all, and she had no choice but to take this chance. Miss Sarah. The voice came from behind, deep and steady, carrying the faint drawl of a man raised on long days and open fields. She turned quickly, breath catching in her throat. Thomas Mitchell stood only a few feet away, exactly as he had described himself in his letters. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hands rough and scarred from years of ranch work, the sun and wind etched into the lines of his face. A worn cowboy hat, shaded eyes that were unexpectedly kind, a shade of brown that spoke of patience rather than judgment. But she noticed, too, the flicker of surprise as his gaze fell upon her figure. His eyes widened just slightly before he removed his hat, running his fingers through strands of graying hair at his temples. "Mr. Mitchell," she answered softly, barely above a whisper. "I suppose you're wondering about," she faltered, her hand moving instinctively to her rounded stomach. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the whistle of the train preparing to leave again. Sarah braced herself for rejection, the bitter taste of shame rising in her throat. Yet Thomas, after a deep breath, placed his hat against his chest and looked at her with a solemn steadiness that eased some of her fear. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice low but sure, "I reckon we both have some explaining to do. But first, let's get you somewhere warm. The wind cuts sharp out here." She followed him, her steps hesitant but grateful, as they made their way across the platform toward the waiting wagon. The horses stamped impatiently, their breath misting in the fading afternoon sun. Sarah could feel the weight of her secret pressing harder, urging her to speak before kindness turned into misunderstanding. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her voice trembling under the strain of truth, "I need you to know something. I haven't touched a man in 15 years. This baby," she paused, tears threatening to blur her vision. "This baby is the result of something terrible that happened to me. I understand if you want to send me back on the next train." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the platform, casting golden light along his weathered features. His expression softened, and he studied her with a patience that felt more powerful than any words. "Miss Sarah," he said slowly, "a man judges a woman by her character, not her circumstances. From your letters, I could tell you were good people. That's what matters to me." The unexpected gentleness in his words broke something inside her. She had braced for anger, disappointment, or cold refusal. Instead, she found acceptance she hadn't dared to hope for. He tipped his hat back onto his head, guiding her toward the wagon as if nothing more needed to be said for now. The ride from town to the ranch passed in silence at first, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves. Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the endless sweep of land rolling toward the horizon. The mountains rose jagged and proud in the distance, their peaks tinged with snow despite the season. For all its harshness, the landscape was beautiful, untamed and honest in a way that mirrored Thomas himself. Finally, as the wagon jolted over a rut in the dirt road, Thomas spoke. "I lost my wife and our baby to fever 5 years back," he said, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Since then, the house has been too quiet, too empty. I never thought I'd write to anyone again, but when your letter came it gave me a reason." Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to answer, to thank him for sharing something so personal, but the words tangled inside her chest. All she managed was a quiet, "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said gently. "Life gives us burdens we don't ask for. All we can do is shoulder them best we know how." When they reached the ranch, twilight had begun to fall, painting the sky in shades of lavender and deep gold. The small wooden house stood sturdy against the rising hills, its whitewashed boards weathered but well kept. A barn leaned slightly against the wind, and a fenced pasture stretched beyond, dotted with cattle that raised their heads curiously as the wagon rolled past. Thomas helped her down carefully, his hand steady beneath her elbow. "Welcome home, Miss Sarah," he said, with a sincerity that made her eyes sting. That night, alone in the room he had offered her, the main bedroom, no less, Sarah unpacked her meager belongings. A few dresses, her mother's old Bible, and the letters from Thomas that she had read so many times she nearly knew them by heart. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she placed a hand on her belly, whispering to the child within, "Maybe, just maybe, we're safe now." In the days that followed, she learned that Thomas was a man of few words but steady actions. He rose with the dawn, worked until the sun slid low, and returned with a quiet presence that made the house feel less lonely. He never once asked her to explain more than she was ready to share. Instead, he treated her with the dignity of a partner, not a burden. For Sarah, who had carried so much shame and silence, his restraint was both bewildering and comforting. Each evening, when the work was done, they shared simple meals together, bread, stew, vegetables from the small garden, and afterward, he often read aloud from the worn books he kept by the hearth. She found herself listening more to the sound of his voice than the words themselves, a steady rhythm that calmed her restless spirit. Yet beneath the surface of this fragile peace, Sarah wrestled with fears. What if the town discovered her past? What if Thomas's kindness was only temporary, a courtesy that would fade once the reality of her situation pressed harder against the future? Most of all, what if she allowed herself to hope, only to be abandoned again? One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of fire, Sarah stood on the porch, arms wrapped around her growing belly. She hadn't realized Thomas had come to stand beside her until she felt the quiet weight of his presence. He leaned against the railing, hat pulled low, watching the horizon. "You'll find this land has a way of making a person honest," he said softly, as though the mountains themselves demanded truth. "It doesn't care where you came from. It only cares whether you can endure." Sarah glanced at him, searching his face for the unspoken meaning in his words. In that moment, she realized he was not merely speaking of the ranch or the land, but of her, of them, and of the fragile bond beginning to form between two people who had each carried loneliness too long. When she finally went to bed that night, Sarah found herself whispering once more to the child she carried, but her words were different now. "We might belong here, little one. We just might." 3 weeks had passed since Sarah had stepped down from the train in Cedar Falls, and in that time, life on the Mitchell Ranch had found a rhythm both foreign and strangely comforting to her. The mornings began with the sound of roosters crowing and the low bellow of cattle in the fields. Thomas was always up before the sun, his boots crunching across the frosted ground, his silhouette moving steadily toward the barn. Sarah would often wake to the faint smell of fresh hay and the muffled thud of hooves as he worked with the animals, tending to their needs before most of the town had even stirred from sleep. She admired that constancy, though she never said so aloud. Inside the small wooden house, Sarah worked to carve out a sense of belonging. The curtains, faded with age, were mended by her careful hand. The pantry shelves, once sparse, now held rows of jars she had organized with quiet pride. She baked bread, simmered stews, and discovered a small satisfaction in watching the house transform from a place of silence into something that felt closer to home. Though she knew she was only borrowing the life Thomas had offered, she wanted to contribute, to prove she was more than a burden. Thomas, true to his word, had been nothing but respectful. He had insisted she take the main bedroom, even after her protests that the arrangement was improper. "A lady needs her rest," he had said simply, carrying his own bedding out to the bunkhouse without waiting for further argument. His quiet stubbornness left her both frustrated and oddly grateful. Every gesture seemed to reinforce his promise he would not press her, not demand anything beyond what she was willing to give. It was a patience Sarah had never known from a man before. Still, despite the kindness, Sarah's heart carried its own unease. At night, when the world settled into silence, her thoughts became louder. She lay awake sometimes, hand resting on her swollen belly, wondering what Thomas truly thought of her. Did he lie in the bunkhouse regretting his decision, questioning why he had invited a stranger, and a pregnant one at that, into his life? She feared that the day would come when his tolerance wore thin, when pity would turn to resentment. Yet each morning, he greeted her with the same even tone, as if her fears were only figments she had created to punish herself. It was on a late autumn evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the mountains in deep purple and gold, that the quiet between them shifted. They sat on the porch together, the wooden boards creaking softly under their weight. Thomas leaned back in his chair, long legs stretched out, hat tipped slightly as he watched the changing sky. Sarah sat beside him, her hands folded over her stomach, her mind restless. The silence stretched until finally he broke it. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, careful. "I know we agreed to marry for practical reasons. You needing a home and protection, me needing someone to share the work and the days. But I want you to understand something." She turned, her breath caught, as his steady gaze met hers. "When that baby comes," he continued, "or she will be as much mine as if they were my own blood." The words struck her like a bell, resonating deep in her chest. She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him he didn't understand, but emotion rushed up too quickly, and she had to look away. Her hand tightened on her belly. "Thomas, you don't know," she whispered. "That child, it wasn't conceived in love. I was attacked back in Denver. A stranger. I ran because I had nowhere else to go. No man should be asked to raise another man's child, especially one born of violence." The porch grew very still. The sound of crickets rose faintly in the fields, filling the silence that followed. Sarah dared not look at him, afraid of what she might see in his expression. After a long pause, Thomas drew in a slow breath, his hands rough and calloused, folded loosely in his lap. "I lost my wife and our baby to fever 5 years ago," he said quietly. "Since then, I've carried a kind of emptiness that no work or land could fill. I know something about grief, and I know something about carrying pain you didn't choose. But here's what else I know. That little one inside you didn't ask for the way they came into this world. They deserve love, same as any child." His words carried no hesitation, no trace of pity, only conviction. When Sarah turned toward him, she found not judgment, but a quiet strength that steadied her own trembling. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of hope, not just for survival, but for something resembling a future. The very next morning, Thomas hitched up the wagon without explanation. He stood by the horses, adjusting the harness, his jaw set in a firm line. "We're going to town," he said when she asked. "To town? What for?" "To see Pastor Williams." Her heart stumbled. "Thomas, you don't have to do this." He looked up, meeting her gaze with unwavering steadiness. "I want to. I've been thinking about it for weeks. This ranch needs the sound of children's laughter again. And you." He hesitated, his voice softening. "You deserve a man who'll stand by you, come what may." The words lodged in her heart, heavy and tender at once. She climbed into the wagon, unsure if her tears were born of gratitude or fear. As they rode down the dusty road toward town, Sarah felt the stirrings of something she had not allowed herself to feel in many years: trust. The church spire came into view, rising tall and white against the endless sky. The bells rang faintly as the horses drew closer, their hooves kicking up soft clouds of dust. Sarah clasped her hands tightly, whispering a silent prayer she had thought long forgotten. She prayed not for herself, but for the strength to accept whatever kindness Thomas was offering. On the steps of the church, Thomas reached for her hand. His touch was firm, grounding. "Sarah," he said, voice low, "we can take this slow. I don't expect you to love me today or tomorrow. But I mean what I said. About the baby, about standing by you." She searched his face, the lines weathered by years of sun and sorrow, and found nothing but sincerity. Her voice trembled as she answered, "Thomas, I think I could learn to love you." It was the first real smile she had seen from him since her arrival, wide and genuine, softening every hard edge of his face. "Well then, Mrs. Mitchell, to be," he said, squeezing her hand. "We're starting off better than most arranged marriages do." The days that followed moved swiftly, filled with preparations and small, tender moments that stitched together the beginnings of a life. Sarah found herself laughing more often, her burdens lightened by Thomas's steady presence. The townsfolk, curious at first, came to accept her with cautious warmth, guided by the respect Thomas commanded. She still carried her scars, both visible and unseen, but they no longer defined her every step. 6 months later, Sarah lay in bed, cradling a tiny bundle swaddled in soft blankets. Their daughter's cries had quieted to small, contented breaths, her tiny fist curled against Sarah's chest. Thomas sat beside her, his large hand resting gently on the baby's back, his expression filled with awe. "Emma," he whispered, testing the name on his tongue. "Or daughter." Sarah's heart swelled at the way he spoke the word, "or," as if there had never been a question. In that moment, every fear, every shadow of doubt melted into something brighter. From the corner of the room, a soft laugh rose. Thomas had their son in his arms, the boy no more than 4 months old when Emma had arrived. He guided the little one's hands carefully, showing him how to cradle his baby sister's tiny head. "Gentle now," he murmured. "She's your sister. You'll have to watch out for her." Sarah watched them, her eyes filling with tears. Once, she had believed her life was nothing but broken pieces, shame, grief, and fear scattered beyond repair. Yet somehow, those pieces had found their way into Thomas's hands, and together they had created something beautiful, something whole. She whispered it aloud, almost to herself, as Emma stirred in her arms. Sometimes the most broken people find each other and make something beautiful from the pieces. Thomas looked at her then, his eyes shining in the dim lamplight, and for the first time, Sarah knew without doubt that she was home.